Welcome everybody to Talking Synths, episode 90. This is a really cool episode because we have a friend of mine that I've been trying to get on Talking Synths for, about a year, and it's just never worked out thanks to COVID and everything else. But please welcome Dan Goldstein of Cherry Audio.
Hi guys, how you doing? Thanks for having me on the show.
Sure, glad to have you. And we also have Lucas. And I've been wanting to have you on for a year, and I kept wanting to do it in person, and it just didn't work out. And so we're resorting to the magic of Zoom. And
I'm glad we finally got to do this. The timing is perfect. Cherry Audio has a new synth, and there's plenty of fun things to talk about. So
yes, indeed,
it worked out. That's all that matters.
Yes, and you're in Las Vegas. And
I am. I'm in Las Vegas.
And Cherry Audio has just released a new product called the Elka-X, which is a VST of the Elka Synthex. And I gotta say, it sounds amazing. And but the first thing I want to say is I've been a hardware guy, so I'm always using hardware, and I'm immune to most VST knowledge and experience. Lucas is not.
Yeah.
But going into this, I don't want people to say, well, and they're not going to because of the view there, but I don't want people thinking, oh, he's just some computer guy. This is supposed to be about real synthesizers. You are immersed in a big room chock full of synthesizers. And I think when I was there in person, you told me you have the largest synth collection in Nevada?
In Nevada, yeah. I've been collecting and repairing and restoring synthesizers for 30 years. I developed a real passion for vintage analog synths in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. I just started collecting and I learned how to repair them. And thanks to Syntaur, so many of the instruments in my collection are running beautifully and well maintained, and everything works great. It's such a service, such an important service that you guys supply to people like me that are passionate about keeping these instruments alive.
And it's because we're passionate and love seeing someone in a room full of synths like that. And so how do you know you've got the largest collection in Las Vegas? Is that verified by the Nevada State Board of Synthesizery?
Yes, which I run. So no, I've been in Las Vegas for over 20 years. I'm pretty well connected to the music scene here in Vegas. By now I've met most of the keyboard players and I've bought and sold keyboards.
I'm not doubting you.
Many of the people here, so I'm just part of the community in Nevada. Believe me, I'd love to be proven wrong. I love meeting people, like-minded people that are passionate about this stuff. But yeah, it's a collection that's just grown and grown. And I'm personally, I've always been a big fan of the more obscure and more interesting synths.
Yeah, I hear you.
Syntax is just, it is probably the greatest vintage poly synth that most people have never seen before. It's so interesting. It's such an interesting synth.
Well, before we move away from this, how many synthesizers do you have? And throw out some names of some of the more esoteric and wonderful ones.
Oh my gosh. I have something like 130 synthesizers in my collection: keyboards, organs, Hammond organs, electric pianos, and then drum machines and all those. I don't know the final number when you include those things, but keyboards is at least 130, and that's always growing. I have all the Oberheims from the OBX to the Matrix 12. I've got even the OB1. I've got a 1969 Moog modular, a rather large Aries modular system, a System 100M, and oh gosh, just ARPs, and I can't seem to stop.
Well,
I don't know.
do they have 12-step programs for that?
I don't know. I've never found one. Being married, I thought would sort of be the 12-step program, but my wife is very understanding and
Yeah.
probably a bad influence. She collects books, so we're both kind of collectors. And yeah,
Well, that's great.
I had at one point in time, I had a Mellotron in the kitchen, and that was crossing a line. Or, so there are limits, but yeah, there's a lot of keyboards around here.
Yeah, that's an amazing collection. And the Synthex, to be more specific on the topic of today, you're right. That is such an esoteric synth that most people have never gotten to play. And with all the hundreds and hundreds of synthesizers that have come through this place over the years, never a Synthex until a few months ago when Lucas and I visited the Vintage Synth Museum in Los Angeles. I played one for about 5 minutes, and that's the sum total of my experience with one. And it was great.
Years back, probably 10 years ago, I got obsessed with finding one. They are, again, they're not just, I mean, they're just so interesting because they're not just the greatest polysynth to come out of Italy. They were actually wildly innovative. There are features on a Synthex that don't exist on any other synth, and they should. It was ahead of its time in a number of ways. It's got to be 300 pounds. I mean, this thing is just a massive instrument.
Yeah.
And mine, I'm happy to say, when I finally found one, mine was restored by Mario Maggi, who was the inventor of the Synthex. He, I guess for a while, maybe still is, but he would go through them in Italy and restore them and get everything working like new. And so mine was imported into the United States directly from Mario Maggi, and it's a really wonderful example, and I'm really proud to have it.
That's really cool.
It's also a synth that we've been wanting to make a model of for a long time, because we are, Cherry Audio is really driven by wanting people to experience the things that we've been able to experience by collecting these synths, and so many of these instruments are just not available to people that want to play them. I looked it up and I found out the Synthex, there were only 1,850 Synthexes made total worldwide, and they're from Italy. So how many made it to the United States? I don't know, but there's just not very many that survive to this day.
And when did the Synthex come out? I should have looked that up, but 80s?
1981. So it was, historically, it was the right synth at the wrong time. If you think about 1981, everything was dominated by the Prophet 5 and the Oberheims and the Memory Moog and these great synths. And 2 years later, the DX7 came out and MIDI came out and
squashed everything.
Yeah, and Elka was just not a company that made high-end polysynths. It people looked to Oberheim and sequential circuits for instruments like that.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that the Synthex just was not a big hit, but it is a wonderful synth. It's a great sounding synth. It has everything you want in a great polysynth and a bunch of unique things like a multi-mode filter and a built-in sequencer and just things that you very seldom find on things like Jupiter 8s or Oberheim OBX-As. So it's very cool in its own right.
Yeah, it has a very refined sound. I can't quite put my finger on what it is that appeals to me so much about it, but man, it really sounds great. And your VST really sounds great. And some months ago, you or Cherry Audio posted something online of here's 5 synthesizer sounds. Some of them are the real thing. Some of them are the VST. Can you identify which is which? And I followed that thread on the Analog Heaven forum, and what, about 50% of people, it was likely as not to guess the right thing. And I got to admit, I didn't do it because I didn't want to damage my own image of myself.
that was a very, very interesting experiment. All the sounds in that experiment were from a hardware mini moog or from our Miniverse emulation of the mini moog. And it wasn't meant, we weren't trying to insult anyone at all. It was purely an experiment to see, could you tell a hardware mini moog from our software mini moog that we were convinced was unrecognizable, that you couldn't tell it apart from the original. Interestingly, the end results of that were a perfect mathematical 50-50, as good as flipping a coin and guessing. Nobody could tell the two apart reliably. And interestingly, a lot of people got 0 out of 6, and some people got 6 out of 6. But as a whole, people generally got about 3 out of 6, 50-50 guess. And I don't know. Look, it's not to pat ourselves on the back or to say that our emulations are, so stunningly good or anything like that. We were curious. We were curious to see. And I think the VST technology has gotten so good. I mean, I'm a huge hardware fan, but I can't tell. I mean, I didn't do any better on that test than anybody else did. I can't tell the software from the hardware. That's how good the technology has gotten. And I'm very proud of that. We are driven. I mean, that is so much of what goes into the art of modeling these instruments, is to take something like the Synth-X. And, again, it's a rich analog sound. It's a great sounding filter. It's got so much character to it. And what we've done is we've created a model. I'll play that same sound on the software. And when we do it right, they have that same tone and that same character. And it's not an easy thing to do. A lot of work goes into getting that right. And thankfully, we have the tools and the technology to do that now.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated by the process of how you do that. And when I was thinking through it, I thought, as I come at this as a sound designer, and it seems like the process is very similar. Like if I wanted to sit down at an analog synth and say, I want to make a trumpet sound, then I would start thinking, okay, there's an attack to the sound that kind of identifies it and is kind of recognizable, and I'm going to make a fast pitch blip at the attack, and then I want it to stabilize out and become a more pure sound, and I think through it like that, and then start programming and come up with some version of what I think it should be a starting point, and then you refine it from there. And I think you probably do the same sort of process. Like, okay, we have an Elka Synthex, and it's got 2 oscillators, and it's got this, and so let's program a rough starting point, and I don't know, it seems like a similar process.
Yeah, I mean, you're definitely not wrong. There is a whole lot of playing a note on the hardware, playing a note on the software, carrying it, going back and forth. We spend a lot of time looking at spectral analyzers and oscilloscopes and looking at the specific wave shapes and the frequency content that comes off of an instrument and replicating that. There's a lot of little characteristics, like how does the instrument overdrive? So, for example, one note on a synth, you can replicate one note, but a lot of polysynths, a lot of the character comes from playing many notes and how that can overdrive the VCA and introduce a little bit of distortion or overdrive. These are all characteristics that make an instrument sound the way they sound. For example, many vintage analog synths, they make sawtooth waves, they make square waves. Surprisingly, a lot of these waveforms are really pure and uncolored from a lot of different manufacturers. They all look like sawtooth waves.
Right.
But there are sometimes little differences. I don't know why, but the triangle wave on a Synth-X is a little bit softer than the triangle wave on a lot of other synths. Some of the high end is rolled off. And so it'd be really easy to just put any old triangle wave into our software, but we want to capture the character of the Synthex. So it's a lot of the little things. It's also on these instruments, for example, the Jupiter-4, the arpeggiator of the Jupiter-4 is legendary. People talk all the time about how cool the arpeggiator sounds on a Jupiter-4, but I've never found anywhere where people explain what's unique about it. And so when Cherry Audio recreated the Jupiter-4 in our MERCURY-4 plugin, I had to figure out the logic that their arpeggiator used. And it's super interesting how it works. But recreating that perfectly, that's so much of the character of the Jupiter-4. It's not just the sound, it's not just the oscillators and the filters, but it's how it responds. It's some of the special features, how the arpeggiator works, how the sequencer works in the Synth-X, which is sort of interesting. All these little details all add up to replicate the experience of sitting at one of these classic synths. And we try to get all of that right. Even the response of the knobs on the instrument. When you turn a filter knob, a cutoff knob halfway, that frequency at halfway is unique on a lot of synths. Interestingly, the Synth-X, the filter at maximum with everything wide open, it tops out at about 17 kilohertz, which is unusual. Most synths are wide open, but not the Synth-X. So it gives it a slightly dark character compared to other synths. And all of those little details are things that we try to find and emulate and sort of perfectly recreate. You can play a Synth-X all day long and not know that the filter doesn't quite open up all the way. You know, you might not be able to say that, but it's part of the sound of the instrument.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to get to where it is now?
Oh, it's months and months of work. We spend a whole lot of time. I mean, the Synth-X has been a project that we've been wanting to do for a year. And so from the design work of the front panel and the artwork and the knobs, through to all the research and all the R&D that goes into studying the instrument, it's many months of work. At Cherry, I don't know how other companies do it. At Cherry Audio, we are always working on multiple projects simultaneously. So we have the next 6 months worth of products in development right now that, you know, we're always working on something. So it can be a little difficult to say what date we started, you know, exactly working on the Synth-X, but it's been a project for quite a long time that we've been working on.
And how big is the team of people that worked on that project?
Cherry Audio we have 14 people that are part of the company. We also have quite a large and growing team of sound designers that work on the presets for this synth. So I'm not sure the final number. I think we had 7 different sound designers working on the presets for the Synth-X. There's over 600 presets that ship with Elka-X. And I'll tell you, that process is really amazing because every sound designer sits down at an instrument like Elka-X and comes up with very wildly different sounds. And those sounds are really reflective of the personalities. We have 2 female sound designers on the team, and the sounds that they come up with are so good and so different from the sounds that some of the men come up with.
Oh, that's interesting.
All these different perspectives, every sound designer brings something new to the table. And I love that because a great instrument, a really flexible instrument, a great polysynth, can make so many sounds depending on how you approach it. I don't know about you guys, but because I've been playing synths for so long, whenever I sit down at a new synth, I always tend to make the same sound and start at the same starting point.
Yeah.
And you know, I play an E minor and I'd make a big brassy Oberheim kind of sound on almost any poly synth that I sit at. And I think we get sort of stuck in those patterns. And and so, you know, as I say, great sound designers can bring their own starting points and their own perspectives and just come up with things that we don't expect. As someone who's been working on instruments like this and creating plugins for a long time, there's no greater feeling than pulling up a preset and not knowing how they made that sound. I mean, I did all the DSP for this instrument. I don't know how some of these presets were made. They're so cool. So that's a joy.
Yeah. I was really struck by the presets. And
especially the chords ones were really good.
Yeah.
Chords, that's a new feature. That's not a feature that's original to the Synthex. We added an arpeggiator to it. We added a chord mode, a unison mode, velocity sensitivity, a few other things, a couple more effects. The original Synthex has a great built-in chorus effect. We added reverb and delay to it as well. One of the real challenges with Cherry Audio with recreating these synths is adding a little bit more to these synths to make them useful in a modern setup.
Yes.
Keeping what's great and unique about the original synth. And it's so tempting to go overboard and say, oh, let's add more oscillators and more envelopes and more LFOs. But we always have to pull ourselves back and say, you know, the original synth is classic and really cool the way it is. But with a few little additions, we can make it even more useful.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on exactly that. I know that must be excruciatingly hard to come up with something that sounds so great and think, oh, if we just did this, it could sound so much greater. But it really comes down to making appropriate choices. And I think I remember commenting with Korg about doing the same thing on the ARP 2600 and the Mini Korg 700 FS that they did. There are some extra things, but they're so appropriate and they don't take away from the main instrument.
Honestly, it's the hardest part. It's the hardest part of the job, is the restraint. The story I like to tell is when we worked on our very first standalone synth emulation, which was our DCO-106, our emulation of the Juno 106. I sat down with my sound designer and with my artist and my synth designer, and we said, okay, we're going to make a Juno 106. Everybody loves the Juno 106. We're going to emulate this. No other company has emulated the Juno 106. And so we're going to do that. And we sat down in our very first meeting and we said, okay, the Juno 106 is great, but it's only one oscillator. So let's make it two oscillators. And it's only got one envelope generator. So let's add another envelope generator. And within 10 minutes, we had recreated the Jupiter 8. We had
I was going to say
into a Jupiter 8.
Yeah.
And we said, whoa, hold on. That what's so great about the Juno 106 is it's so simple and you can't make a bad sound on it.
Exactly.
And we've turned it immediately within 10 minutes into this really complex major polysynth. So we scrapped everything that we did and we started over. And we said, let's keep what's great about the Juno 106, but add velocity and maybe one or two other features. And we learned very early on that there's a line and we have to find that line with every instrument and we have to not cross that line.
Yeah, that's a tough call, but you've done it very well with the Elka-X. So what is your end specifically of the process in recreating this with Cherry Audio? Are you software back-end, front-end, user interface?
So I'm the CTO of Cherry Audio, technology officer, and I run the team that makes these products. So all these projects are basically run by me. We have designers, artists, sound designers that work on the designs of the instrument, the layout, the feature sets. I do all the DSP. So everything you hear the oscillators, the filters, the effects. For most of our products, that's usually code that I've written, although we sometimes partner with Mark Barton, who's a really fantastic engineer and DSP engineer. And so sometimes we work with him on some of the filters, or in some cases, the entire DSP of the instrument. But most of what you hear and everything that you hear in Elka-X is code that I've written. So that's my aspect of it. Our lead designer, Mitchell, usually has the final say on what features it will have and what the layout will look like. Although we all get together and talk about what we want the instrument to have, and we argue about what we should add to it and what we shouldn't add to it. Interestingly, our sound designer, James, our lead sound designer, brings a really, really valuable perspective, because he's the guy that's actually sitting down and making hundreds of presets with these instruments. And so before we get too far into the process, we usually have him look at the design and say, hey, you know what? I could do so much more if we just added one or two things. So the original Synthex, one of the quirks about it is the LFO square wave is bipolar. So it's a bipolar LFO, which means when you use it to modulate the pitch of anything, the pitch will rise and then drop.
Right.
That's really unusual. Most synthesizers, starting with the Mini Moog on up, are unipolar, where the pitch will stay the same and then rise. And as you turn up the mod wheel, it'll rise more and more, but it always returns to the original pitch. So we added a unipolar square wave to the LFO because it's so useful and because it probably should have been there in the first place. And then our sound designer says, hey, you know, if we had a sample and hold random wave in the LFO, we could make a lot of cool sounds.
Yeah, yeah.
So we also added that. So again, everyone brings their perspective and their experience, and hopefully the end result is better because of all the feedback and all the ideas that go into it.
Well, it's really cool. I got to say, demoing it made me, for the first time, think, you know, maybe I should get a VST and a little controller, because I ain't going to get a Synthex anytime soon. So for me to think that as a hardcore hardware guy, you've really got something going there.
Yeah, again, I'm as hardcore hardware as they come.
Yeah.
And, so, you know, I think nobody is more critical of what we do than we are. Our team is made up of serious synth collectors. And so, you know, for example, as you know, a Roland Jupiter 4 is a pretty rare synth to find. We had 3 of them in our collections. I have one, our designer Mitchell had one, our sound designer James has one. So we had 3 of these really rare synths that we could sit down, and we discovered that they were all kind of different.
Yeah, sure.
In fact, I learned this, I didn't know this until we started researching it. There's actually 2 different versions of the Jupiter 4 with 2 different filters. And it turned out we had both versions of it.
Oh, cool.
So there are decisions that have to be made. Which filter sounds better? You know, which version do we emulate? Which of these rare, unusual instruments do we use as the basis for what we do? But we're very fortunate to have a team made up of people that are very passionate about hardware.
And so I guess each of them had a Elka Synthex, right?
You know what? This is the only Synthex that we had.
Not surprising.
The whole company, but fortunately, it's a really great example of one. And our lead designer Mitchell lives here in Las Vegas as well. He's a friend of mine for a long time, and so he actually came when I finished doing the modeling of the synth. He came here, picked up the Synthex, took it to his studio, and it spent weeks in his studio while he did a lot of critical listening and we tuned in the model. It always helps to have more than one set of ears and eyes looking at what we do to make sure that we didn't miss anything, to make sure that everything sounds right.
Yeah.
And so even if we just have one instrument, we could still share it.
Yeah, well, that's great. Well, I think we're about at the end of our thing. So this has been great, Dan. Thank you so much. And to the guys at Cherry Audio and the Elka-X crew, fantastic job. And we'll say modulator.
Modulator.
Thanks, guys. Modulator.